So what I would like to do tonight is to just continue looking at the text in Hebrews together, just to sort of address, cover, review some of the key steps in the exegetical process, so that as we move towards discussing about the sermon, that we just have one more opportunity to practice some of the key parts in the process of identifying the author's intended meaning. All right. So again, these are all the steps we have looked at so far. The first 10, all the way through meditate on the passage. So the next step we will look at is to what we call is generate the homiletical idea. So I'll talk about that maybe toward the end of tonight, or definitely, Lord willing, starting next week. But tonight, I wanted to just continue, as I said, looking at Hebrews 12, 1 and 2, such a helpful and important passage. Wanted to continue to review some of the key steps, as I mentioned. So to do that, first I'm going to just briefly review what we covered last week, and then we'll go to the next step together. But let's go ahead and start just by, if I could have someone read, maybe David, if you're there, could you read Hebrews 12, 1 and 2 for us to get us started? Actually, I have it on the right side of your screen. Can you guys see the?
Yeah, shall I start?
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1 and 2. Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witness surrounding us, laying aside every weight and the sin which so easily entangles us, let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God.
Great, thank you. All right, so last week when we gathered, we focused on the block diagram. So today I would like to finish the block diagram, and then talk about the exegetical ideas from the passage, and then the timeless truths. Now, normally, when we study a passage, obviously there are many other steps in the process that we have talked about previously, but I just wanted to really focus our attention on what I think are some of the key steps in the process. They're all important, but I wanted to really focus our attention on these three in particular for this exercise. Okay, so with that, let me take you to what we did last week, which was first we identified the independent clause. Remember, in the block diagram, that's the first step. Try to find the main sentence or sentences. Okay, and so we identified let us run the race. That is, let us run the race. That's the main independent clause. Everything else in these two verses is modifying that in some way. All right, let us run the race. And then the second step we also carried out was to identify the connector words, which are highlighted here, the various conjunctions, prepositions, relative pronouns, and several participles, as it turns out. So we did that step as well, and then we just went through each and every phrase and clause and identified them. A couple of things that we discussed was just noting that sometimes a clause can be separated by a phrase. We see that with let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. So here, with endurance is a phrase that was inserted between the verb run and the object race. And then we saw it again later in verse 2, who for the joy set before him endured the cross. That the clause there is who endured the cross, which I've highlighted in green. And notice that the author, in this case, put two phrases in between. Again, just for the sake of emphasis, he did that. But that makes it more confusing when we're trying to figure out the different phrases and clauses there. So we went through that. You can look in the notes or the video last week to get more details on that. We discussed several of words like so and that and for, which can have different functions in English. And so we talked about how do you tell the difference between those. It's nice in Greek if we were studying the Greek, because there is the words there, like the word for, we would know just from the Greek word if it's a preposition or a conjunction. So in English, it's not as clear, but that's what we're looking at as the English text right now. So we've done this step. Again, we finished that last week when we gathered. So now I want us to move on to the third step, which is, at this point, now we've identified the phrases and clauses. Now we want to ask ourselves, how are they functioning? How are they working in the passage? What are they doing? What are they modifying? And how are they modifying? And if you remember, the adverbial phrases are those which modify a verb. So if you have a phrase or a dependent clause, and if it's answering one of these questions, when, where, why, how, result, it's going to be modifying an action. All right, so that will be modifying a verb. And then you have those phrases or clauses which are describing a noun, telling us what kind or which one or who. And those will be modifying a noun. They'll be answering these questions. So what I'd like you to do is just try to go through these phrases and clauses and just on your own first, see if you can identify what they are modifying and how. Now, I've done that for the first two just to show you what I'm asking. Therefore, which is a conjunction that connects what he's saying here to what he just said in chapter 11. Then he says this, there's a dependent clause. Therefore, since we have so great a cloud. And that actually is modifying run. And here we have an example of a clause that's modifying something that comes after it. So they don't always modify something that comes before it. In this case, the author, wanting to emphasize that cloud of witnesses, first mentions them before he mentions the independent clause. All right. And the way it's functioning here is it's modifying run. It's telling us why. Why are we to run? Let us run. Why? Since or because we have so great a cloud of witnesses. The second of witnesses is a phrase, and that's modifying cloud. It's telling us which cloud. It's describing the cloud. It's identifying the cloud. Which cloud is it? It's a cloud of witnesses, a group of witnesses. All right. So what I'd like you guys to do at this point is take the remaining phrases and clauses, which I've set out for you, and just do the same thing. Try to identify what it's modifying and also how it is modifying. Okay? Any questions on that? All right, so yeah, again, sorry, you're gonna have a little bit of assignment tonight. You're gonna have to do a little thinking before bedtime. So this will be an opportunity for you to practice again, and then we'll go through it together. All right, so, and I'll be around. If you have any questions, feel free to ask, okay? So I'll give you a few minutes now to work on this, and then we'll come back together. Okay, well, let's see how you guys did. I've already done the first two, as I've shown you on the screen there. So let's start with the next phrase, which was the surrounding us. Surrounding, if you remember, is participle here. And let me see. How about if I'll start with Pastor Philip and just maybe have you do a couple of these, and then I'll give everyone a chance to participate in the fun. All right. So, Pastor Philip, what surrounding us? What do you think it is modifying, and how?
Yeah, Pastor, I think surrounding us, this phrase modifies witness
Okay.
by
Witnesses.
telling, witnesses by telling which witness.
Yes. Yeah, it's describing the witnesses, those witnesses who are surrounding us. So good, very good. How about laying aside every weight?
Yeah, this phrase also modifies, I think, the cloud, laying aside every weight. This phrase modifies cloud by telling how.
Okay, so is it describing what the cloud is doing? How is it modifying? How is it modifying cloud?
Yeah. Oh. Yeah.
Here it's describing
Oh,
an action.
sorry. Yeah. I think laying aside modifies the sin. Yeah, sorry. So in my exercise book, I wrote cloud, but I realized that it was wrong. It is wrong. And laying aside, I think it modifies the sin.
Okay, it says laying
Oh,
aside every weight. Oh, sorry, there shouldn't be a comma there. Laying aside
yeah.
every weight and the sin. So sin goes with weight, right? It's two things.
Yes.
You're laying aside every weight, you're laying aside the sin. But yeah, I don't think it's modifying cloud. And it's not modifying sin, because sin is one of the objects. Laying aside every weight is the first thing, and laying aside the sin is the second thing. So it's got to be
Oh, yeah.
modifying something else. Now you're correct. It's telling us how. So if it's telling us how, notice it's going to modify. Is it going to modify a verb or a noun?
Uh,
Notice up,
now. Oh,
notice up
sorry.
here.
Verb.
Verb,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's verb.
It's going to modify an action.
Hmm.
So there's only a couple of verbs, right? Have is one verb. Let me use another color here. And then the other verb is run. Which one makes more sense? Is it describing how we have a great cloud, or is it describing how we should run?
I think how we should run.
Yeah, I think that makes more sense.
Yes, sorry. Yeah,
Oh, that's okay.
I am wrong. Yeah.
No, this one is more difficult because it's modifying something that comes later. Those are more, usually we are used to phrases or clauses modifying something before it, like of witnesses modifies cloud, or surrounding us modifies witnesses. So usually the phrase or clause is modifying something that has already been said. But in this case, it's modifying something that he is about to say, that he has not yet said. So that makes it a little more difficult.
Yes.
Oh, okay, very good. Fu Wei, I'm going to give you an opportunity here. So the next phrase, and the sin, where does that go? Is that modifying something, or where does that go? How does it function?
It's connect with the weight.
Connect with, sorry, which? What's it connected to?
Connect with every
Yeah,
weight.
good. Yes, very good. It's because we have a coordinating conjunction here, that word and, that's telling us that this is going to be connected to something grammatically equal. Well, so it's a noun, it's going to be connected to another noun, weight. They're both the object of laying aside. What is being laid aside? Weight and the sin. Okay, very good. How about the next one? Which so easily entangles us?
He modified the weight and sin by telling us how it works.
Okay, by telling us, well, it's describing the weight and the sin, right? Which weight? Which sin? So by telling, actually in this case, which, because we have the word there also, which. So that helps us to see it's modifying these two nouns, weight and sin. Again, notice it's answering the question, which one? Which weight? Which sin? The sin which so easily entangles us. All right, good. The next one we've already identified. It's the independent clause. Independent. It's the subject and verb of independent clause. All right, how about the next one, Fu Wei? With endurance.
It modified runs.
Yes, and how is it modified?
How by telling us how it runs. How we run.
Good. How are we to run? With endurance. All right, very good. And then the race is just the object of the independent clause. Let us run the race. Let us run what? The race. Okay, good. All right, David, it's your turn to have some fun. Can you do the next clause here? That is set. What is that modifying and how? And remember, this word that, we discussed this last week, but we may not remember. If we're trying to figure out, okay, is the word that, how is it acting here? Is it a conjunction or a relative pronoun? And what I said is if you can put the word, replace it with the word which, and see if it makes sense, then it's a relative pronoun.
I think it's modify runs. Or, yeah. And by telling how.
Okay, so is this that is set or which is set? Okay, which is set also could make sense. So normally when it's a relative pronoun, it's going to be describing what kind or which one. All right, so in this case, that is set is actually, I don't think it's telling us, it's not describing the action here. I think it's describing a noun. In this case, it's telling us which race, the race which is set, that race. So I think it's actually modifying race in this case. Again, often the first thing maybe that would help when you do this step is the first thing I always do is just say, okay, I assume it's modifying the word right before it. Okay, that will normally be the case. So when you encounter, so, if you look at these, we have "and the sin which so easily entangles." So I'm first going to assume it's modifying the word before it, sin. And I ask myself, does that make sense? Well, a couple of reasons. So I'm talking about which so easily entangles us. There's the word which is telling me, okay, it's going to modify a noun. That word which is going to describe something about a noun. And then I ask, okay, so sin is a noun. So does that make sense? Is it describing sin? Yes, it is. So I would say, okay, that makes sense. With endurance, let's look at that phrase again for a minute. I would first assume it's modifying the word before it. And so then I just want to say, does that make sense? So let us run, okay, with endurance. Okay, with endurance, that sounds like it's describing how, answering the question how. So I go, yes, if it's answering the question how, it's going to modify a verb, an action. And in this case, that makes sense. It modifies run by telling us how. And then I do the same thing here, the race that is set. So I'm going to just assume first that it modifies the word right before it. Now that's not always the case, but often, I think more times than not, a phrase or clause will modify the word before it. All right. So you just maybe start there if you're not sure, and just ask yourself, okay, if that is set, could that modify race? Well, let me think about it. Yeah, it's a relative pronoun here, that or which, the race which is set. Yeah, which race, which one? So that does make sense. Now, that's not always the case again, but usually you can start there if you're not sure. And ask yourself, does it make sense that this phrase or clause could modify the word before it? All right, so maybe try that approach. So David, as we look at the next one, before us.
Pastor,
Yes.
Pastor Tim, I think so. I mean, like, it should be not by telling how, by telling which.
Yes. Good. You're right. All right, because the word, the idea of which is in the phrase. So whenever you see which or who, for example, there's a who down here, right away you can know this is going to modify a noun. All right. If it's which, it's going to modify a thing. If it's who, it's going to modify a person. Okay. In fact, let me just write that in. And sometimes, again, the word that might be used, all right, because sometimes the word that in English can function the same way. Okay. All right. So before us, the race that is set or which is set before us. David, what do you think that modifies? And again, think about the process here. It's before us, so it's describing what question might it be answering. When we think about before, the word before, usually that describes a location, right? Or a time. And in this case, before us, it's like a location. So if it's a location, it's answering the question where something is happening. So it's going to modify a verb, an action. Okay. What do you think?
I think it's modify a cloud of fig-nets.
Okay. What would the question is answering? Or how would it be modifying?
What?
Okay. So let's think about that for a minute. A couple of things. One is, so cloud is pretty far away, all right, in the sentence. That doesn't mean that it can't modify cloud, but it's less likely. The further away a word is in the sentence, the less likely it's modifying that word. All right, so we want to start with words that are closer to the phrase. So if I think about it, I go back and say, okay, what question is this answering? All right, before us. That's either describing a time or a location. All right, and so I think this case, it seems like it's describing a location, a where. It's answering question where something is happening. All right, and if that's the case, if it answers the question where, then it's modifying an action, telling us where something, where an action or a verb is happening. Okay. And in this case, so I'm on to look for a verb. So I only have a few options here. I'll just highlight them in green. I have the verb is, run, and have. So which one would make the most sense? It's describing again where, a location, before us, in front of us, is the idea. What do you think?
Run.
Okay, run is a possibility. Let us run before us, or the word is. It's telling where it, excuse me, where is the race set? It's that race set before us. Okay, does that?
Yeah.
I think is makes the most sense for a couple reasons. One, it's the closest verb. All right. And two, when I ask myself, does it make sense that it's describing the location where the race is set? Yeah, that makes sense. So I would say that it's modifying is because it's telling us where it is set. All right. Okay, that's a little bit of a challenge. So
yeah,
but good.
Thank you.
Oh, all right, thank you. Let's see. John Cheng, if you are there, how about you take on the next couple? Good evening, by the way.
Good evening.
Good evening. Fixing our eyes.
This modifies the how we run.
Yes, good. Modifies saying how. It's answering the question how. How do we run? Fixing our eyes. Now notice this case, it's answering the question how, which is going to tell us, okay, it modifies a verb. It's describing how an action happens. So we go back and look at what verbs do I have? Is, run, and have. So in this case, though, it makes more sense to go with run, telling us how we run, not is. Okay, that wouldn't make much sense. That is set. How is it set? Fixing our eyes. No. It makes more sense that it's describing run, as you put. So very good. How about on Jesus?
On Jesus, where we fix our eyes on.
Okay, good. So modifies fixing by telling, what question does it answer?
Where should we fix our eyes?
Where? Good. Yes. Now, here's an important thing to consider. So that's an excellent job in identifying this, because it's that word on normally describes a location. So we would say, okay, on Jesus, that's describing where. So it's answering the question where something is taking place or happening. That means it's going to modify a verb. Now, fixing is not a regular verb, it's a participle. But remember, participles is a participle, not a regular verb. But again, participles are verbal nouns. So they do have a verbal, they can have verbal characteristics. So they can be modified, is my point, by other phrases or clauses. In this case, it's the fixing is kind of a verbal idea. So on Jesus is where we are fixing our eyes. Okay. All right. Very good. Let's see. I'm going to ask Norman to do the next couple here. The author. What is that modifying and how?
Jesus.
Yes. Good.
Who?
And yeah, it's telling by telling who. Okay, and here notice there's something he could have said this a couple of different ways. He could have said who is the author of faith, but he didn't. He just said the author. All right, so he skipped. He didn't put who is. Now it's answering the question who, but sometimes in order to have a more direct, stronger connection, the author will not use that relative pronoun who. So it's this, Jesus, and then the author, he's saying really like it equals, the author equals Jesus. This is called, for those of you that care, apposition, where actually the words can be interchanged. You can say on Jesus or on the author. Okay, so and let's see, do we have, we did have a comma here, right? Yeah. So in this case though, just it's referring to Jesus. It's telling us who. It's describing Jesus. All right, how about en perfecter? Where does that go?
I may be wrong, but the word en perfecter of faith, I think the two of these words are referring to the author, who is Jesus.
Yeah,
I mean,
notice
basically, yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I think is describing Jesus, so I think it should be there.
Yes. Notice the word and. That's a connect. It's connecting. It's linking author and perfecter together. So it's actually doing the same thing as author. It's modifying Jesus, as you said. All right. It's a second description of Jesus here. Jesus is first the author, and second and perfecter. All right. So they both are modifying Jesus, and that word and tells us that they're connected together that way. Now, how about of faith, Norman?
Faith is I think it modifies perfecter. It's talking about our faith.
Yes. By telling which perfecter.
Yes.
Describing that, and it could go with author too. I think it goes with both in
Yes.
this case, since we have the word and. So we probably would put perfecter and author. Okay. All right. Good. Very good. Shulan, I'm going to ask you to do the next couple here, if you don't mind. And again, remember, in this particular case, we had this clause, as we discussed last week. This clause is split up by these prepositional phrases. So here it's a little bit more of a challenge. That's why I'm giving it to you. You're an expert. So if you could let us know. Okay, who? Remember, it's the subject of the dependent clause, but what is it modifying? Who endured the cross?
Okay, who modified Jesus?
Yes.
Okay, by telling who?
By telling who, right? We have the word right there.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
praise God for that. That makes it a little easier. Okay, so who endured the cross? This is the also modifies Jesus, right? Because it's part of the full clause. So I'm just gonna note that here. All right. Now, how about for the joy?
Don't do that. Okay. Okay. So no, this one is for the joy. Okay. Okay, this one is modified. Modify endure the verb.
Okay.
Telling why.
Very good. Now, why did you say that? That's correct. How do you know it's modifying or by telling why? What's your reason
Because
for that?
the preposition for is for the intention.
Yes. Oops. So that word for means because, yeah, intention,
Purpose.
purpose, good, reason. Okay, so in this case, yes, it's describing a reason. Why did he endure the cross? For the joy set before him. All right, good. Now that's an interesting statement if you think about it, right? That Jesus endured the cross, and one of the reasons was because of the joy set before him. So we'd have to answer the question, well, which joy? What does that mean? That would be something you would need to explore further. But as far as the diagram is concerned, yes, for the joy modifies endured. We have another example here of a phrase modifying something that comes after it. All right. So this particular author seems to like to do that. All right. How about set before him? This one's a little more difficult. What does that modify and how?
Okay, set before him modify the joy.
Okay. By telling
it can be which.
Yes, it's describing the joy. Which joy? The joy set before him. So this was that word set. Last week, if you guys remember, we talked about this word set is acting like a participle here. Even though it's not ending in ing or ed, it's an English word that, in this case, set can be can act like a participle. So this was actually a pretty difficult phrase to deal with. So that you did a great job with that. Okay, so it's describing joy. It's telling us which joy. The joy set before him, that joy. Who endured the cross. So that's the rest of my dependent clause. Now, Shulong, I'll give you one more here. Despising the shame. Despising the shame. Where does that go?
Modifies endure endure to. Yeah, endure by telling how he endure. Despising the shame.
Good. How did he endure? By despising the shame. Again, it's participle here, modifying the actions, describing the action. All right. All right, good. That was one of the harder sections of this passage, those phrases. So very great job. Okay. And has sat down. That's a second part, a second dependent clause with the subject who. So this is also modifying Jesus by telling who. All right. How do I know that? Because of this word and. It's connecting the two verbs, who endured the cross and who has sat down at the right hand. Okay, that who is implied there. So both are modifying Jesus. They're describing Jesus. Okay. Let's see. Joshua, I don't think I've called on you yet. You want to finish us off here? At the right hand.
At the right hand, modifying set down.
Yeah, by telling what question is it answering?
Where he sat down.
Yes, good. At is normally describes a location. All right. Okay, of the throne.
Modifying again at the right hand of the throne. Yeah. Which side of the throne? I mean, telling us.
Yeah, I think hand makes sense. It's telling us which hand. Again, remember, whenever we have the word of, almost always, it modifies the word right before it. You can assume that. It's very rarely is it modify something else. Almost always the word right before it. So of God. So that tells you the answer to that one too, right?
Yeah. Same, the throne.
Yeah.
Yeah.
By telling which throne. It's specifying, describing. All right. Well, yeah, there's quite a few challenges in this passage. So good job, guys. You'll have the notes. So if there's any questions that you have or not clear, you can go back and look at, I'll have it for you. You can kind of go back and look at that. Any questions before we go to the next step on anything here so far?
Yeah, I think this exercise is just help us to be very precise. I mean, rightly or accurately handling the word of God. It's like every phrase, every word, every verb, every noun is accounted for. Yeah, I think that's good.
Yeah, and this is definitely the most challenging step in the whole process. It's definitely the hardest. But one thing to consider is this step also is the most helpful because it's forcing us to think about, like you just said, Joshua, every phrase, really every word. Okay, what is it doing here? And it's forcing us to ask the question, okay, how does it function here? What is it modifying? What question is it answering? And sometimes you're going to get it wrong. You know, we won't correctly understand, but you just go through the whole thing. As I said before, don't get stuck. If a one part doesn't make sense, just guess and keep going. And this is where I think you can help each other. Usually I have somebody else check my diagram. I want to see what they did, someone else who knows how to do it. And a lot of times that process really, really helps. Because if it's just me, I may not, you know, a lot of times I may not understand it right, or I may not be thinking about the other possibilities. But having somebody else help me and tell me, oh, this is what I put. And then as you talk about it, you say, oh, that makes sense. So I've had many, many times where having someone else doing it also, and then comparing has been really profitable, very helpful. So even that's why I wanted to do this exercise with you, because I know you guys think about it, and then we do it together, and maybe there's some things you hadn't considered. Hopefully this has helped you in that way, but this step is not only the most difficult, it's the most fruitful, because it really has forced us to think about how everything connects together. And that process is one that really will help us to see the structure of this. But I would encourage you, especially if you're new to this, is to do it with someone else. So do it with someone else in the class, even, with the passage that you're doing, and then compare notes with each other. So with that, here we have, I just put down and summarized all of this is for step 4 now. We take what we got from step 3, which is identifying what each phrase is modifying and how each phrase or clause modifies. Now we want to just show it visually. All right, we place that phrase or clause, we indent it over or under the word that it modifies. So for example, we indicated, since we have so great a cloud, that modifies run. So what we want to do is, what I do is I first look for my independent clause, which is here. So the independent clause stays on the far left. All right. So since is going to modify run. So here I notice where run is. So I'm going to put since, I'm going to indent it over run. Okay. You see that? So here we have, let me just do this. All right. It's modifying run. It's indicating why we run. Okay, and then we talked about of witnesses. We said that was under modifying clouds, describing a cloud. So I'm going to put it underneath cloud. Okay. All right, laying aside every weight and the sin. Now I said this was connected to weight. It's describing a second thing that's being laid aside. It's connected to weight. So, and the sin. Let's see here. Which sin? Okay, which sin, which weight? Okay, we said that modified sin and perhaps weight. And then let us run. That's my independent clause. Oh, sorry, I skipped one. Laying aside. We said that also is modifying run because it's describing why or how. I think I got that wrong. How we run. All right. And then we said, let us run. So that's the independent clause. So that's going to be all the way on the left with endurance. Again, that's another how we run. So I'm going to put that under run. Okay. And then the race, that is part of the independent clause. So I'm just going to keep that underneath, or sorry, not underneath. I want to keep the word order. So what I do is I typically will just draw a line to connect the full clause here. All right. So run, let us run, and then the race. So that's all one clause. The subject is us, the verb is run, and the object is race. So those all go together. But because the author split the verb and the object, this is how I do it. I just put a line in, or you can highlight it, and that shows you it's all part of the same clause. Okay. And then we said the race, which race? The race which is set. Where is it set? Is set before us. So is set is my verb. Okay. Before us is a location. And then we had fixing our eyes. Okay, that's also modifying run. It's telling us how. How do we run? By fixing our eyes. Where do we fix our eyes? On Jesus. So that's modifying fixing. Fixing our eyes on Jesus. The author, that's referring to Jesus. Describing who? Jesus, the author and perfecter. So there's two descriptions of Jesus here. Okay. Of faith probably describes both perfecter and author, since those go together. So what kind of author? Which author? Or which perfecter of faith? Who? Can we identify that? Also is modifying Jesus. And that's the subject of the dependent clause, who endured the cross. Okay, and again, I'm going to use a line to connect those together. And here we're going to run into a problem. Okay. Now with that, sometimes too, you might want to highlight it. I'll highlight it in green just so that it sticks out a little better. These were my two dependent clauses there. Okay. So who, for the joy, and as Shulong told us, that's modifying endured because it's telling us why he endured. Who, or for, reason. Okay. So he endured for the joy. Which joy? The joy set before him. So I'm going to put that under set. Who, again, who endured the cross, despising the shame. That too modifies endured because it's telling us how he endured. And then, and has sat down. That's my second dependent clause. So it's sharing the same subject, who has endured and who has sat down. Where did he sit down? At the right hand. So that's answering the question, where of the throne, that's which hand. And then finally, which throne of God. Okay, so that's the whole the whole process here, the whole diagram. All right, now I usually keep in parentheses or brackets these comments because that helps me to understand the how each phrase or clause is modifying. Now, let's notice a couple things. How many points is the author making here? What's the focus?
1 point.
Yeah, there's 1 point, right? And what is that point, John Cheng?
Run the race.
Yes, that's the independent clause. That's the main idea. All right. So everything else, so it's this command really, right? Let us run the race. Again, remember, let us run, that's a form of an imperative. It's the way you would describe an imperative of this in the first person. Let us run the race. That's the main idea. Everything else is modifying somehow. Okay? And you can notice where we start is saying, okay, what is directly modifying that independent clause? Well, we have, I'm going to highlight it in, I guess, blue. We have these phrases and clauses that modify run. You see that? We have two here, a clause and a phrase that are modifying run, telling us why and how. Now, I'm going to actually, with further study, oh, that's right. This is why I said that. I'm going to save that for a little later. Well, maybe I'll mention it now. Actually, I remember before I actually had why here. Now I remember why I did that. Laying aside here with further study is actually the idea of having laid aside. It's describing something that has already taken place. It's having laid aside every weight and sin. So he's describing here something that has already happened. The tense of laying aside is actually an aorist. It's more of a past tense idea. So it's having laid aside every weight. It's describing another reason why we run with endurance. So there's really, this is why I think he inserted these two before the word it modifies, because he wanted to separate why we run from how we run. Okay, why do we run with endurance? First, because we have a great cloud of witnesses. We have a number of those who have gone before us, who testify of God's grace as they endured by faith. And then secondly, another reason is he's describing here, basically they've repented. They've made a profession of faith. That's why the laying aside every weight and sin is a description here of repentance. Need to fix that. And then, so those are, I think, why he puts the two motivations first, before the command, and then after the command, he gives the two ways. How do we run? We run with endurance, and we run by fixing our eyes on Jesus. And then under Jesus, he has several descriptions of him. I'm going to come back to this in a minute, but I just want you to see, we can see by the diagram sort of the order of priority. We have let us run the race as the main idea, since it's the independent clause. Then we have two modifying phrases and clauses before it, and I believe they describe why we run. And then we have two modifying phrases after the command that tell us how. Okay, so again, I want to come back to this in a minute, but this step is simply just taking what we did under the third step, which is identifying what each phrase and clause modifies and how, and just simply moving that phrase or clause, indenting it compared to the word that it's modifying. And then we have the visual representation of the passage. And then from that, we can see the structure more readily. Now, sometimes you may not, as you're going through and trying to identify how a phrase or clause modifies, you may not have understood it. A lot of times when I'm actually doing this step where I'm putting the phrase or clause under the word it modifies, sometimes that helps me to know where it goes, because sometimes I may not realize it actually until I try to diagram it, and then it makes sense. Now, any comments or questions on this before we go to the next? I know it's a challenging exercise right before bed, but hey, any questions?
Tim, how about the with endurance, the phrase, let us run with endurance. With endurance is it's modifying how we run.
Yes.
And fixing our eyes, yes, it's also modifying how we run. But could it also be further elaborating on how we run with endurance, or further clarifying what it means by running with endurance?
Yeah, I mean, endurance here is a key idea. In fact, I want to talk about that. So maybe hold that thought, and as we go through the exegetical idea in the next few minutes, maybe that'll answer what you're asking. Because yeah, that's a good question. With endurance modifies how the races we are to run, but it is kind of a key idea in the passage as well. Any other questions? Okay, again, you can go through in the notes and kind of try to go through the process again. I would encourage you to just try to do this diagram again on your own. Don't look at the notes. Try it again on your own and then compare to the notes since we've gone through it. Now, what I wanted to do was, and it looks like our time is escaping here, is I wanted to, now normally the next step would be textual observations, where we would look at this passage. Remember, identify the verbs and describe the verbs, describe the pronouns, look for purpose or result statements, look for lists, rhetorical questions. We had that whole, those, I think, 11 things to look for. Again, you can go back in your notes. And then the next step was the significant words, then identifying particular words that you would want to study. In this passage, I think witnesses would be an important word. Endurance is an important word. It's repeated, endurance, endured. You might want to understand what is the weight that he's talking about. So those would be words you'd want to do a specific word study. And then consult resources. And then after all of that, and this is the step I want to move us to, is state the exegetical idea. Okay, so I want to move to that step just for the sake of time, and just remind you of this, and we'll probably have to pick this up next week when we gather together. Is again the goal of exegesis, right? It's to find what the author meant. What's his intended meaning? That's what we're after. What did he intend for his audience to understand? And we call that the exegetical idea. Okay, that's the author's main point, his focus. Now, when we move to the sermon, we as the preacher, the expositor, will come up with a homiletical idea. Okay, that's our sermon main point. Now, it'll be connected to the exegetical idea, but there may be some modification, and that I'll explain as we go forward together. But before the expositor is ready to move to the sermon, he has to be able to say, well, what did the author say? And why did he say it? And how did he say it? So the exegetical idea we could represent by what we would call the authors. I don't even say it here. The authors, what, why, and how. That is, in the passage, what is the subject of the passage? That's the author's main point. What is the context of the passage? That's why the author gives that main point. And then what is the outline of the passage? That's how he develops his point. So to identify the exegetical idea, that is the author's intent, what he's trying to communicate, there's three parts to that. What did the author say? That's the subject of the passage. Why did the author say that? That's the context from the passage tells us that. And finally, how? How did he say it? What's the structure? How did he develop that point? That's the outline of the passage. So all of that combined is the author's what, why, and how, or the exegetical idea. And so to understand, so I want to do this for Hebrews 12, 1 and 2, but because of the time, it's already the end of our time. What I'd like you to do is this. I think it will really help our discussion next week. And I think it will really open your eyes to, this passage, Hebrews 12, 1 and 2, I believe is really the thrust of the entire book. And it really is a key statement made by the author and what he's been moving the whole book towards. So we have to understand what the purpose of the book of Hebrews is, and that'll help us understand why the author said what he said here. I think you'll find it actually a very helpful discussion, but I want to, we don't have time to do it all today. So what I'd like you to do for this week, if you can, is go ahead and read through the book of Hebrews and try to identify, if you can, its purpose? What is its focus? All right. Normally, we would do that, right? If we're studying a passage, normally we would do that, you know, that'd be the first 3 steps. So I'm not asking you to do those first 3 steps here, but go ahead and just read through Hebrews this week, get familiar with it again, and try to answer the question, what is the purpose of this book, the book of Hebrews? This will tie in directly to the exegetical idea, the author's what, why, and how. Okay, because the what, that's the focus of the passage. And I think that's pretty clear from this text. The focus is, let us run the race with endurance. Right? That's the main thrust here. That's the independent clause that identifies. But this is really a summary of the author's, the focus of the book. It's really the call to the hearers. So I want you to read through the book this week, and I think that'll help you to see that. So the focus is, let us run with endurance. That's the author's what. Okay, run the race of the Christian life to the end. Now the question is, why? What prompted him to give this command? What is it in the book, or what is it in the context here that the reason for the author's main point? And that is what, let me just tell you how we find that, and then we'll finish for tonight. So we have the author's what. I think that's pretty straightforward. Let us run with endurance the race. That's his focus. That's his main point. Okay. Why did he give that point? Well, to determine the why of the author, that is the context, there's 3 levels. You first want to look in the immediate context. That is the passage itself. Does he give any specific reason inside the passage, either by using the word so that, or therefore, in order that, for, because? These particular words indicate reason, just as Shulong mentioned earlier. So do we have any statements like that in the passage that tell us why we're to run with endurance? That's the first thing to look for. The second level is, sometimes the author gives us the why, the reason for his statement, somewhere in the surrounding context. All right. In the broader context of the passage. So maybe something he says right after, or something he says right before. That can be found in the author's flow of thought. And I'm going to show you next week how we see that from Hebrews, this passage in Hebrews. And then the third level or circle of identifying the why of a passage is, how is this statement, how is the author's what, his main point, how is it connected to the purpose of the book? Okay, so we have those 3 levels to find out the author's why. Sometimes he'll give the reason right in the passage that you're studying. Sometimes he'll give the reason right around the passage you're studying, right before or right after. And sometimes that reason is also connected to the purpose of the book. And in this case in Hebrews, we're actually going to see that the why, the author's why, is connected in all 3 categories. There's a reason given in the passage, there are reasons given just outside the passage, and then there's a reason connected to the purpose of the book. And so hopefully next week, as we look at this passage, I'll be able to show you how it all comes together. When you're looking for the exegetical idea, you're going to see how all the steps we've done before are important to help us, because you cannot preach a passage until you know what the author's saying and why he said it. You have to know why. All right, if you don't, you could misinterpret his point. And by the way, if you understand the author's why, that's going to help you as you teach the passage to your hearers, because the author's reason often is the same reason or application that we will have for our hearers. And I'll show that to you next week. Okay. So I promise we are moving towards the sermon. I know this was another exegetical exercise, but because of its importance, I really want to reinforce and go over another example with you for the diagram, to diagram the passage, but then also the exegetical idea. This is where everything's brought together. So I wanted to use Hebrews as an example here to show you how the author's why is connected not only to the passage, but even around the passage and to the entire book itself. And while we have to know the whole book to understand each part of it, the book. Okay. All right. Well, thank you for your patience and your diligence, brothers. Any final comments or questions before I ask Pastor Philip to close us in prayer? Anybody have anything?
Pastor Tim,
Yes.
I have a question, but it's not related to today's topic.
Okay, sure.
Because I understood. I think when we first started the class, I approached it in a wrong manner because of fear. But as I started doing all the assignments, it really opened up my eyes to see many things of the passage and all that. But I want to focus on the first 3 steps, which is the third step actually, because we did on the book of Philemon. So Philemon has got only 1 chapter. So it was much easier to do. But the one that we have to do now for the contextual flow, we have to do Colossians 2 and 3. My question is very simple. Do we do the introduction as individual passage, or we do the introduction, we take the 2 passages and combine what's the introduction? Or do we do it individual? Because my thinking is, because you are talking, you spoke about the body, first the introduction and the body and everything. So that's why I was thinking, because Philemon is one passage, but what happens if there's 16 chapters? So how do we do that?
Yeah, then it's really fun.
Say it.
Yeah, like First Corinthians, right? It's 16 chapter Romans. Yeah, so the epistles, right? They're laid out with you have the introduction, which is usually the first 2 or 3 verses, and then most of the epistle is the body. It's the topic that he wants to cover, and then sometimes you'll have a short conclusion at the end. Though Romans and First Corinthians are almost a full chapter, the conclusion. But so when you were saying, maybe can you ask your question one more time? Then you're comparing Colossians and Philemon's. Philemon's is just 1 chapter, so it's a short letter. Colossians is a little longer; it's 4 chapters.
Correct. The assignment that you gave us to do on Colossians, that means we are supposed to come up with the introduction and the body. So now, if I'm and the closing statement. So when we are talking about these 2 chapters, so because we are not starting in chapter 1, we are starting in chapter 2 and 3. You're asking us to do chapter 2 and 3. So that means I find the introduction in chapter 2, and then I find the body, and then I find the end. Am I supposed to do that?
No,
because
no,
the
I'm
end
sorry.
is in chapter 4.
No, I didn't mean to confuse you guys on that. The introduction is just is only in the beginning of chapter 1. So I just gave you chapters 2 and 3 to just instead of giving you the whole book, I just gave you chapters 2 and 3 to do the contextual flow. That is just summarize each paragraph. I think that was the assignment.
Yes,
so,
correct.
Yeah, no, you won't have, the introduction is just at the very beginning of the letter. So I just had you skip chapter 1, I think, to do the contextual flow, just to make the assignment a little easier. So you don't have to do the whole book. You should do the whole book. Yeah, so sorry to confuse you on that.
No, because I watched the video twice, and when you were doing in the video you were doing the introduction, so I was kind of set back. Hey, how am I supposed to do the introduction when it's in chapter 1? So I wanted to do 1, 2, 3, and 4. So
Yeah.
I did not want to be a smart aleck to go and do something that you did not tell me to do. So that's basically it. So that's why I wanted to ask you. But since you said that I can do 1, 2, 3, and 4, I want to attempt to do it and then pass it out. At least because it's just 4 chapters, it's very easy to read.
Yeah.
So that is the
Yeah.
reason why I just wanted to find out.
Yeah. And
Thanks, Pastor.
when you complete the assignment, then I'll send you my what I'd had for it, so you can kind of compare.
Okay, thanks, Pastor.
And
Thanks.
my goal this week, brothers, is to catch up on the grading. I've been I've been a bad teacher. I've not been grading timely, so I got so behind. So I apologize for that, but my hope is this week to catch up on the assignments you guys have turned in, and so that to encourage you to get more of the assignments done.
Okay, thanks.
All right, so thank you for that question, Norman, though. I appreciate that. And then I'll send you my answers, or what I got for that assignment once you've completed yours, so you can compare. Okay. I did get a note from Zhao Li. He wrote on our WhatsApp group. So I don't know if you saw that, but he said 3 of 4 of us are positive. Me, my wife, and daughter have lost sense of smell. My wife has worse symptoms. She's waiting for her antibiotic. None of us have temperature by the grace of God, and we're getting food from friends in the church and the community. So, but we could keep praying for their family, just that they could recover quickly. And so maybe Brother Pastor Philip, you can remember them as we close in prayer together. You could close us.
Sure.